So for those of you who don't know or who may be unfamiliar with Agilicus, real quickly before we dive into the topic of today, we're a cybersecurity company. We focus on access, specifically zero trust access. I should also back up actually and mention, I mentioned this previously, but unfortunately the audio wasn't working. If you have questions, throw it into the chat for us and I'll try to get to them as I go through the presentation, or I'll circle back at the end. But yeah, so Agilicus, we're a cybersecurity company, focus on access. Our entire mission is to provide simple, secure access to critical systems. We want to do this from any device and of course without leveraging a VPN. Typically the companies that we work with, they're looking to keep critical systems off the public internet, reduce things like time, cost, and complexity when it comes to remotely connecting for support and maintenance. Sometimes they want to micro-segment down to the device level within a network. And then sometimes it's simply just about vendor access. They want to allow vendors a way to access in without compromising the security that they inherently built into their networks. Just some more quick background for us. We span multiple industries. We work with small companies right up to some federal projects. Some are obviously more public than others, but some common characteristics across the bunch. There's systems and applications that do require secure access. There's groups or pools of users, both managed and unmanaged. So vendors, contractors that need access to said systems. And there's usually a mix of modern and legacy systems, some of which don't have security natively built in. Thus, more often than not, our conversations lead us to the operational technology space. And so for today, what we're going to cover, we're first going to take a look at some of the threats and challenges we're up against. Then we'll clearly review the requirements from both an OT as well as an IT perspective. It's the OT versus IT conversation everybody loves. And then finally, we'll highlight the industry standard that we're seeing pop up across everything, which is called Zero Trust. And we'll dive into what that looks like from an implementation perspective within your respective organizations and how it solves a lot of the challenges we'll frame up in the first portion of the discussion. And so let's start with the basics. I really want to start thinking about when it comes to securing operational technology, OT, when it comes to securing those networks, what are we trying to achieve? We talk about things like air gaps, but what are the outcomes that we're actually looking for? They usually revolve around 5 or so things. We want to protect the networks from both bad actors as well as human error. We want to protect the systems from disruptions or outages. We need to maintain control and safe operation at all times. Some of us have ovens on the manufacturing floor that could be turned into an actual bomb at a given time if the wrong individual went in there or simply somebody made a mistake. And then of course we want to increase operational uptime, productivity, revenue, efficiency, all that fun stuff. And then ultimately protect the corporate brand, the intellectual property, the physical safety of employees who are working at a given site. These are objectives that often span multiple different categories, but the common denominator across all of these would be cybersecurity. None of us want to create a door that allows somebody on the outside to simply walk in and have a negative impact to any one of those 5 categories that are listed. So I don't want to go too much into the stats because everybody talks about the stats, to be honest with you, but these are some key stats released by IBM. So this is in review of 2022. This was their 2022 key security stat report. These numbers, they're trends, but they're relevant and pretty interesting in this environment. We hear things like ransomware all the time. Everybody thinks it's never going to happen to us. We're too small. Nobody wants our stuff. But the reality of this is that 21% of all cyber attacks were ransomware in 2022. 41% of those attacks used various phishing techniques to basically trick staff into providing access. This is just a simple human error. Somebody who was already on the network, who you trusted, was in your building, simply made an error which caused something bad to get in. 33% were vulnerability exploits. They used a door that was in the network, they found it, and they broke through it. With manufacturing specifically on the bottom line here, it ranks number 1 for cyber attacks. It is the prime target. And 61% of all operational technology attacks live within the manufacturing industry. Of those 61%, 36 were ransomware, which is disproportionately higher than others. And when it comes down to it, it's clear that changes need to be made. New security measures need to be implemented. The individuals who are targeting these areas, they're targeting it because they know what we know. There's systems that live in these environments, they're vulnerable, they haven't been updated in years, and simultaneously they're critical to the operation of the business. We know that, they also know that, so they're trying to cut the Achilles heel. And so that's why we're seeing new standards, new regulations, new requirements pop up all the time. I don't want to list them all. I cherry-picked 3 of them, but really we're seeing more and more each week depending on the industry and the intended outcome. You'll notice that across all of these, there's a new term, potentially new to some. It's not new in the industry, but it's zero trust, and it's now prevalent almost unanimously across the board. It's key to what we're going to be discussing later in this presentation. You know, the specific standards that you see in front of you here, whether it's these, it could also be cyber insurance. They all say that an upgrade to a zero trust framework will bring you the greatest benefit by far when it comes to security. But what we're going to dive into is why is that? What do they mean by that? And why is this the right direction to go? And so I'm going to reference one of the ISA reports titled Common ICS Cybersecurity Myths. It was pretty interesting. It looked into 5 separate categories. We're going to focus on just a few of them today, but it's important to remember before we dive into this that OT security, the security of that network, is completely dependent upon the effectiveness of both the design of the network as well as the firewall rules associated with it. Everything is designed to ensure unauthorized access does not happen. You don't want somebody in China that shouldn't get in, getting in. That is the entire point. Firewalls are very important. Don't get me wrong. They're certainly the first step in the puzzle, but you can't stop at the firewall. Firewalls in general are only as good as the policies and rules that are created. It just leaves room for error. You might be immaculate with how you stay on top of things, but as long as there's 1% chance there's going to be an error, how do we make that better? And so, like I previously mentioned, you might have a certain level of trust when it comes to an individual connecting into your environment. I work with vendor X. Joe over there is fantastic. He's a great individual. He's going to connect in tonight at 8 p.m. He's going to fix, the PLCs and everything's going to be great. But what happens if that actually accidentally lets something else in? And now they're behind your firewall. The malware, the bad actor, they're behind your firewall. You didn't intend for that to happen. What's next? That's where you can start to see where zero trust plays a role. And so in relation to these 5 categories, what we're going to look at for the discussion today are 2 of them. The myth of the air gap and the myth of the unbreachable firewall, because they do go hand in hand. And so to kind of level set before we get into things, when I say air gap, what I mean is that 2 networks are physically isolated from each other. For example, your OT network could be completely isolated from your corporate network. Some of you might agree that that is what's happening. It's important to understand not only this in theory, but also in practice. Many networks, many companies that I talk to, they claim to be air-gapped, but they often forget about one particular scenario. And it revolves around this question: how do you give remote access today? And the answer very frequently is we don't. No remote access. And then I ask, what about when a machine's about to go down? What about when Siemens needs to get in to ensure that line doesn't go down? How does that vendor who's not in the proximity of that facility, how are they getting access? How is that done today? And that's where things change a little bit, because the answer usually is one of these 3 things. It's easy. You give them a VPN, you monitor it very strictly, it's no problem. Well, part of this conversation today, I want to explore what the unintentional impact of this is and why these companies keep getting hacked because of it. So if we look at this scenario, here's a typical approach: corporate network, secure network, maybe that's your industrial control network, your operation technology network, your scanner network. They're separated. They're not connected at all, right? Nothing can get across. Then you separate this for a reason. You say, I don't trust my OT network to be connected to my corporate network. It's just too risky from one to another. But now all of a sudden you need somebody to support that HMI, prevent that line from going down. What do? Well, in most cases, you spin up a VPN, you give them a VPN, they get in there, they do the job, you monitor it very strictly, you have some safeguards in place, and everybody's happy. Well, it seems good. You now have a valid user connecting to your network. Everything's great. They're helping you out. They're keeping the line operational. At this point, you're thinking about the air gap that you have in place between that OT network and the corporate network and how that's intact. And then we just put in some new sensors. What about those temperature flow sensors that exist on the factory floor right now? Well, they're now getting streamed to a cloud environment. Somebody at headquarters is looking at the dashboard that's displaying that data, which also lives in that cloud environment. And so all of a sudden a connection's made there. If we go back to that valid third-party vendor who's currently VPNing in, well, like many of us, they're at home. They're on an unmanaged device. The device is not provided by your company, and thus you have no control or visibility over the software that's installed on that. They could have an antivirus. They could have all these things. Maybe they don't. Maybe it's not up to date. At the end of the day, what's happening here is a door is being created. You're creating a door in the firewall. The thing that you purchased to make sure things stay out of it, there's now a door there. And so you're saying a valid user can get in, but what happens if something that is not attached to that user unintentionally comes through with it? Well, that's where you get this notion of, I trust the user, but you're actually saying I trust everything that could possibly come along with that user. And even worse, once that individual connects with a VPN, it's on-off access. So this means that that user and everything and anything bad that could possibly come along with that user can now go laterally anywhere within your network. So this, is a network that at the start we thought was air-gapped. It's completely separate, except the logic now is this. Even though the corporation has spent sometimes millions of dollars on corporate security, corporate network security, we separated that OT network from the corporate network for security reasons, to ensure the security of that OT network. But we're now trusting a third-party vendor, an individual that is on an unmanaged device, an individual we may or may not know, to connect from home. When's the last time any of us patched the printer that we have at home? I haven't. It's not something I think about. I don't think everybody does. And so we can start to see where all of this breaks down, where it leaves room for error. So going back to where we started, we can see, why the myth of the secure air gap is busted in the first place and why that article focused on it. It's busted in the traditional model. The traditional air gaps simply aren't practical. They don't take into consideration the new needs, the needs of the equipment that's being serviced. If that line is about to go down, I have to get somebody access. They don't live in the proximity. They need to support this. This needs to stay up. The business relies on it. And so in every single case with a traditional air gap, they end up compromising the security of that air gap network because they need to hand out a VPN. Somebody needs access. So what I say when I have these conversations is plan for that. Understand that that's a reality. If that vendor does not get the access they need, they are going to find a loophole. That loophole is going to be substantially worse than if it was addressed in the first place. So planning for that. Priority one, we must secure that network. Absolutely. But people also have a valid reason to connect remotely. They have a service contract. They need to service that PLC, that the HMI that is throwing, errors that needs to be cleared, right? If that doesn't clear, potentially that line can go down. Millions in inventory and revenue can be lost. You might have to shut down more than just that line, clean everything out if it's a plastic extrusion company, right? They have unintended consequences that cost far more, and if somebody doesn't get access to support that. So you should permit a connection, but remove trust from the equation. Layer in all the other stuff, the real-time monitoring, sensors, cloud environments, dashboards. These are now truly complex networks. They have complex needs. Air gaps are fantastic. I agree. But our conversation today, and in these next few slides, it's going to revolve around how do you take the air gap and how do you make it work within a modern world? And that's really the discussion I want to have today. So before I fully dive into that, one last thing that I'll put on this. So this is a former director of Homeland Security. He once stated that in no case, in hundreds of vulnerability assessments, in no case have they ever found the operations network to be separated from the enterprise network. On average, they see 11 direct connections, sometimes upwards of 250. It's substantial, right? So, and it's not just one of us, this is what's happening because you took something that typically wasn't connected and you made it connected for various reasons over time, because that is the way things are moving. So traditional air gaps, they create a false sense of security. They have this implicit trust baked in, which allows individuals behind the firewall you put there for a reason, and with far too much access. And so the risk is too high to continue down this path. And that's why I want to revisit this one more time. And let's reassess what we reviewed at the start of the webinar. When it comes to securing OT networks, what is it we're trying to achieve? We got to protect the network, limit disruptions, maintain control, increase uptime, protect the organization at large. We need security, but systems must be supported. In these critical environments, neither of that can be compromised. And so the challenge itself is the challenge, a lot of us have on sometimes a daily basis. And it's the conversation everybody's familiar with. It's the OT versus IT. I need access. I need to lock everything down. Now, I sit in a great position. To be honest with you, I talk to both groups. I have the opportunity, this allows me, to take a step back, have a wider field of view. I get to see what's really going on and look at it objectively. And so, what are the true requirements here? People need to get their job done. There's legitimate reasons to have remote connectivity. Sites are spread out. Vendors can't just jump in a truck and instantly be at that site and remedy anything. But at the same time, from an IT perspective, there's new requirements coming in. There's compliance requirements, there's cyber insurance, there's global standards, IEC's bringing out new vendor access standards this year. And so across all of this, it's our job to limit the chance of something going wrong. Limit the options where it can go wrong. People trick staff and contractors all the time into just installing fake software updates, transferring files, picking up USB keys, plugging them in. I can't say this enough. We can't rely on trust. With that in mind, what outcomes are these groups looking to achieve? So if we look at it from that perspective, everyone I work with is looking to achieve similar outcomes. Actually, they're almost blown away when they understand that to achieve those outcomes, it doesn't have to be complicated. And it's secure access into any network from anywhere in the world to anywhere in the world, have a high level of security around mission critical systems and maintain that air gap, improve uptime, allow vendors to access when they need to access, allow them to access it with a single click, not multiple jump points, and increase the reliability when it comes to monitoring that equipment, right? If that connection keeps going down, if you do give a connection and then things happen, network changes occur, and then that vendor can't get in, it's unreliable. So let me show you at this point how we achieve this. So what I'm going to put up here is a bit of a diagram. So what you're seeing is Agilicus, our all-in-one zero trust solution. Keep in mind, from a management perspective, it handles absolutely everything. And this is done to limit the risk within a network, right? Take the human error out of it. From an administrative perspective, all the administrator has to worry about is the email address of the user he wants to give access to. The system handles everything else. So from a deployment perspective, we look at the right side of this diagram. That is your secure OT network. What we do is, without any new hardware, we create an outbound only connection to the back end of our cloud. We do that with a little piece of software that can live anywhere within that network. At that point, it's not on the public internet, it's not reachable, it's not scannable, it doesn't exist. That site does not exist. Now, when a user wants to access something, if we look at the left side of this diagram, they open up a web browser and two questions need to be answered. Who are you? To which the user logs in with their existing credentials. They don't create new usernames and passwords, and I'll explain why in a second. And then the system already knows this. What level of access do they have? And they know that because you programmed it in. John has view-only access to the HMI. I can see what's going on, but I can't actually change anything. And so what this does is it then takes two outbound-only connections, one outbound from the web browser, one outbound from that site, and it splices them together. A user only has access to a single system. You map a user to a single system instead of a network. And that way, they access that resource as if they're on that network without ever being directly connected to that network. Where a VPN connects a user to an entire network, we map a user to a specific resource, a one-to-one relationship. They cannot access the entire network. And it doesn't matter what the use case is. It could be something as, dramatic as Studio 5000 if you're a Rockwell shop, which is, quite the beast to play around with. It could be RDP. The use case does not matter. We simply make it look like that individual is on that network without ever directly connecting them to it. And so it's important to point out that on the left side of this network, so I've alluded to it a few times, we do what's called federate identity. And so what that means is no more shared accounts. Everyone that we work with, you, me, everyone, we all have our own corporate emails. And what we can do is trust their identity, so they control their identity. You have control over what they have access to. So you give John access by writing in my email address, I log in. What does that do? Well, if we think of, some of our OEMs, sometimes they have thousands of remote staff. And right now, if we spin up a VPN and a shared credential, then maybe 1,000 people have access to a spreadsheet with that on it. What happens if somebody gets fired? If you fire somebody at your own company, you remove them often before you fire them. When your vendor removes them, did they notify you to change the password? Did they, tell you immediately when they fired them? What's the gap in time there? Does that individual still have access? All these questions are open. Whereas when we use their identity and federate it to provide access, then as soon as they're deleted from their own corporate directory, they don't have access. If something goes wrong, we have a full audit log if you're, have a question about it. And so as a result, we can then audit right down every single action that's done. You have proof of who does what, when. And remember, these are outbound only connections. So you spin this up, there's no changes to your firewall. You don't have to make any network changes. It's an outbound only connection. It's a satellite network, a cellular network, no problem. And so a closer look, if we want to dive in a little bit more into what's happening, again, everything is taken care of by the platform. The only thing that you need to do is add a user's email address. What the platform then does is it maps that user to the resource of your choosing. It federates the identity. We can inject the multi-factor in front of anything, SSH, RDP, but we protect everything with role and app-based access controls, web application firewalls. All of it's done through a reverse proxy so that there's no doorways on your site. Nobody arrives at a door and then does a challenge. And in relation to the air gap, to bring this back, now that we understand how our workflow how our workflow happens. If we want to apply this concept to an air gap, we never connect a user directly to a site. Whereas a VPN does, it's a network to network. What's on this network is now on that network. You maintain that air gap under our model at all times. Users can get their job done. They can access things that you permit them to access as if they were on that network without being on that network. And so if we look at the two users on the left, same example as previously. The first user, that's a vendor who needs to support an HMI or PLC. They're at home. The second user, that's a senior leader in a given organization who wants to view the dashboards. With us, under our connection, we can map one-to-one that user, that specific HMI. Nothing else on that network exists to them. Same with the individual who's looking at the dashboards. And so they can connect at any time from any network, from any device. We assume every connection has malware on it, and we facilitate a connection that does not allow that to travel to your network. The benefit of this is all the risks we spoke about, we remove them. But users can still get their job done, and that's the most important part. We're not a barrier. And so from the user's perspective, what does this look like? Well, all they see is a URL, and everything else looks exactly as it looks today. We simply challenge them, say, hey, who are you? They log in with what they're already familiar with, their email. We get a token that comes back, and then boom, it's magic, as if they're on that site. There's no risk for them to move to other systems in a given network. We had one example, one of our organizations were very concerned that a vendor could come in and they might have to connect to Robot Arm 3. But Robot Arm 1 through 10 look pretty similar, and if they connect to the wrong one and swing it around by accident, they could kill somebody. There's no option there. You're mapping a user to a very specific thing. There's no risk of them transferring files, stealing information, introducing things like malware into the network. The use case that we're talking about today, of course, is very focused on operational technology for good reason. But the outcome, again, taking it back to some actionable items, the outcome is that with a simple 15-minute implementation, you protect the vulnerable systems, ensure safe operation, avoid insecure remote access solutions, avoid a company bringing in a backdoor. You provide remote access to individual systems, not an entire network. You maintain compliance, or perhaps meet compliance if you're not already doing so when it comes to deploying multi-factor authentication, privileged access management, things of the like. You air gap those OT resources from the IT and public networks. You avoid compromising investments you made. Perhaps you brought in your own private cellular network and spent quite a bit of money to do so. You're not compromising that by handing out a VPN. You maintain that security that you invested in the first place. And then, of course, the way that we do things, we attach identity to everything. So you have a very detailed audit. Who did what? When did they do it? What was your exposure if something went wrong? If somebody left a laptop open in a Starbucks and walked away? Did somebody do something on your network? You can check and verify and validate. And then, of course, deploy reliable access. There's nothing worse than spending hours to ensure a vendor has access, or for them to deploy something new and it takes 3 months to get up and running because you have to sort out this access aspect. This is a reliable connection. It's not susceptible to network changes, again, because it is outbound only. And so for our customers, the value is simple. Enhance security, instantly deploy a zero trust framework. Increase operational efficiency, allow vendors to access when they need to access, and ensure all that equipment stays up, and make it seamless for the users. It can't be yet another security hurdle. It can't be a new task they have to learn, new software that they have to deploy on their device. This is all done through a web browser. Anybody with a computer and an email address can have access. There's no hurdles. And so based on a lot of the conversations that we had today, or up to date, I wanted to make one offer available. So I'm putting my email address here, but I spoke with my CTO, and so a lot of the conversations we have, individuals are currently going through an OT-IT re-architecture. So I want to make him available, with his permission, of course, he has agreed to it. I want to make him available to have a free consultation with anyone who wants. If you want to reach out to me and just go through, here's our network right now. What do you see? Where do you see areas to improve? He's more than happy to have that conversation. And then, so I've put my email up here to organize that for him. Of course, I'm more than happy to demo the platform if you want to take a look at it, if you want to explore it a little bit. You can also email me. We have a general email account, info@Agilicus. I'll leave this up for a little bit, but I might look for some questions here. And feel free at this point to add in more questions if you have some. But let me scroll around a little bit and see what we can answer. It looks like Dawn has been answering some, which is fantastic. Ron, thank you for the great questions. Do you have the ability to share access to a single application? Would we install anything on my users' devices? Great question. We can do a single application, whether it's a web application, a thick client. We can even do, if you need to RDP to a single application, for instance, we can certainly do that. Do you need to install anything on your users' devices? We are 100% web-based. We're through a web browser, first and foremost. If they choose that that's the better model for them, we do have options there, but we are first and foremost through a web browser. Which is great. Scrolling through. Thank you, Dawn, for answering a lot of these. Is there an agent required on the target machines, or what protocol is used for the connection if it requires a session share? Okay, so this, I'll explain this a few different ways, Max. So on the target machine, we need what was called the Agilicus connector, that little piece of software that I mentioned, anywhere within the network. It can live, for instance, at my home. I have one on a Raspberry Pi, and because it can ping my router and my cameras, it can reach them and it can expose them. It doesn't have to live on every single device. So we need that at one vantage point within the network, and as long as it can ping it, it can make it available. And then from a session sharing perspective, so you can do a few different things. So, I mean, there's a pretty robust request workflow. So you can say vendor X has access to nothing, but they can see things and request access from me. And that request could be, I need access for an hour. I need access until next Tuesday. I need access until the project's done. And then you can obviously, there's an approval workflow for that. You can also do, from a session sharing perspective, if somebody was typically using TeamViewer or the likes, then we have what's called VNC baked in, but we do it in a very secure way where authentication and identity is upfront with a multi-factor, and then you have to prove who you are before you get access to that session. I do see Max typing. Feel free if anybody else has questions in here. If you don't want to put them in the chat, if they're a little bit complex, feel free to shoot me an email directly. Either I will answer or I will lean on a few resources on my team if I can't answer it. But please do. Perfect, no problem, Max. But please do put your comments in here. Because of the start, I wanted to make sure we had enough time for questions at the end, so I might have rushed things a little bit. But the folks on the call, thank you very much for attending. And if there was something that I didn't cover and you'd like me to cover, again, feel free to either post it in the chat here or shoot me an email, and I'd happily address it. Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.